All right. So, welcome everybody to this episode for the AAAS STPF Sci on the Fly Fellows podcast. Today, we'll be discussing the Chips and Science Act, which is a milestone in the relaunch of American industrial policy. And we have really some key individuals present here today who crafted the legislation, and we'll also talk about implementation. So my name is Adriana Bankston. I'm currently a AAAS fellow sponsored by ASGCT in the House of Representatives. And we have, just going around the Zoom here, Dalia Sokolov, who's the policy director for the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee, Democrats. We have Kei Koizumi, who is a former special assistant to the president, principal deputy director for Science, Society, and Policy at OSTP. Then we also have Travis York, who is a director of the Center for STEM Education and Workforce at AAAS. And last but not least, Mike Holland, Vice Chancellor for Science Policy and Research Strategies at University of Pittsburgh. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today. So to start us off, I want to talk a little bit about the legislative process, drafting of the bill, and engaging stakeholders, starting with Kay, to help us frame this a little bit broader. Tell us a bit about what is the Chips and Science Act, what does it mean for our listeners, and also what was your motivation for the bill? What's different about it compared to other legislation like the America Competes and so on?
All right. Thanks for the chance to talk about one of my favorite pieces of legislation, the Chips and Science Act. It was signed into law in 2022, but it was a long journey to get there. And I think of it in two parts. Well, it's in the name. The CHIPS part of the Chips and Science Act is a funding bill, which provides $50+ billion to fund the programs that were first authorized a couple of years earlier in the Chips for America Act of late 2020. And the other part is the and science part of the act. And that is a policy bill containing a lot of things. It's a 400-page bill in total. But among the things that it sets out and authorizes is a new directorate for the National Science Foundation, the Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships Directorate, that is taking NSF into new directions of trying to catalyze regional innovation, to expand research capacity and the capacity for people all across the country to participate in science and engineering and benefit from science and engineering. But going back, but as I said, I've been dreaming of that bill for a long time, and it's in collaboration with several of the people on this call, including Dalia. That Dalia and I have been through several of what we call the America Competes Acts. Those are three big science policy bills from 2007, 2011, and 2017. And they do a lot. It's a kind of a grab bag of things. But in every time, there were a couple of ideas that were just left on the cutting room or actually the legislative room floor. And so we kept those around and think someday we'll have a chance to try out these policy ideas. But the story for the Chips and Science Act picks up actually in 2019 when I was contacted by, well, a senator's office. Okay, I guess I can say this, Senator Schumer's office. And he was working on something that he had already started calling the Endless Frontier Act. And it was an attempt to rethink, reimagine the National Science Foundation. And the original vision was rather expansive. They were actually going to rename NSF and make it the National Science and Technology Foundation and give it a $100 billion budget. The current budget is struggling to get to $10 billion. So that's, a tenfold increase in the scale of the NSF. And as that name implied, the vision was to, extend the basic research funding that NSF has long been supporting more into technology and impact and innovation. Long story short, it was eventually introduced after a couple of us in the science and engineering community worked on the bill with Senator Schumer's staff. It was introduced in 2020, and then it passed the Senate in the summer of 2020. But I will say that it was not perfect. I was not as happy with it as I wanted to be. So I was counting on, when the House took it up, to be able to improve that bill and put more of what I wanted to see in it. And I will summarize by saying that I wanted to see um, more opportunities for people everywhere in every community in America to participate in and benefit from science and engineering. And the House came through, thank you, Dahlia and colleagues, in passing an America Competes Act of 2022, was it? 2021, the years blur together. And while the House version was very different from the Senate bill that had passed. And 18 months later, at the last minute, that Science Act was folded in with a CHIPS Act, which was going through a separate process through the Hill, mostly separate. They were intertwined. And what we ended up with on a bipartisan vote in August of 2022 was President Biden being able to sign into law the CHIPS and Science Act that the Congress had passed. And that is the story. And my role in that was originally as an advisor, as you heard, in 2019 and 2020. And then from 2021, when I was back at the White House at the Office of Science Technology Policy, I was, I guess, the science and technology champion in the White House to make sure that the president was able to support the bill and would be really happy to sign it into law when it finally came to his desk, which it did.
Perfect. Thank you so much for setting that up. And always nice to hear the history because it's just interesting to know how this came about. So I want to move over to Dahlia to tell us a little bit about how the legislation was developed. You mentioned the Senate, so were there any points of disagreement there? And then also tell us a little bit about the stakeholder engagement. Who did you engage, and what did they provide?
Yeah, thank you, Adriana. Kay gave a very good summary history. I want to put a little more detail to it so the listeners understand how this very big bill, which is actually a very big package of bills, came to be. In fact, let's putting aside the CHIPS Act and just looking at the and science piece of it. It is a collection of many smaller bills that all have their own story, their own timeline. Kay sort of hinted at it. Let me give you one example. I've been working on the science committee for 20 something years. There's one bill, to Kay's point about creating opportunities across the country. There's one bill in there called the STEM Opportunities Act, which I started working on as a staffer on the science committee in 2007. There had been a report out of the National Academies called Beyond Bias and Barriers, something about the trajectory of women in academic science careers. It was about exactly the title, the barriers that women typically face in academic science and engineering careers, and spelled out both a lot of the challenges and where a lot of the potential opportunities, levers were to address those challenges. And a member of the committee at the time, who was not my boss, she was a rank and file member of the committee at the time, Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson from Texas, she picked up on this and she said, I want to do a bill. This is very important. It had been a career-long priority for her, broadening participation in STEM, including, very much women in STEM. And I had that portfolio on the committee. So I started working with her office to develop legislation all the way back in 2007, which, as Kay mentioned, is when we were doing the first Competes Act. That bill took from 2007 many iterations, broadening it beyond women in science to all underrepresented groups in science, but addressing some of the different challenges differently, not just one size fits all, but a pretty comprehensive bill about broadening participation in STEM, to the extent that the National Science Foundation could lead here. It took from 2007 all the way until CHIPS and Science in 2022 to get enacted. And there's a host of reasons for that. The number one reason was it was very hard to find a partner on the other side of the aisle to join with Ms. Johnson on that. And she finally did find a partner in then ranking member. By then she was chair of the committee, Chairwoman Andy Bernice Johnson. She found a tremendous partner in then ranking member Frank Lucas from Oklahoma. in moving that bill forward and including it in the Chips and Science Act. And for that, I am grateful, and she was grateful. That's one story of one bill in there. I will pivot to the TIP Directorate and the NSF bill, since that's more the focus here. I just wanted to show that to illustrate how that bill has many stories built into it. So Kay noted that what was it, the end of 2019, sometime the end of 2019, Senator Schumer announced at some talk he was giving that he was going to create this brand new entity at NSF, or a brand new NSF, calling it the Endless Frontiers Act. And we were sitting over there in the House, kind of scratching our heads, saying, what's on his mind? What is he thinking about? So we email over to his staff at the time, say, hey, what's the senator, have in mind here? Is there an actual draft bill? And they said, well, we're not sure, and no, there's no draft yet. So this is 2019. Maybe I have the timing not precise, but basically he announced it before they had a lot of concrete ideas on paper. So we said, okay, we will sit back and wait to see what happens. You're the other body over there in the Senate. We'll wait to see what happens. Reach out anytime you'd like to. And they went through a process. Kay was engaged. A lot of people I know were engaged in sort of a small group discussions with the Senate office to develop what actually became, in writing, the Endless Frontiers Act. And to us in the House, we were watching this, and to us in the House, I think we shared some of the same concerns that Kay expressed. I will speak just for me, and where my head and my colleagues' heads were at the time, is that it looked a lot like trying to create a DARPA-like entity at NSF. Too much like trying to create a DARPA-like entity at NSF. DARPA has its own tremendous history, ups and downs, many successes to point to, right? But it's a different beast in a different agency. And we have been able to kind of replicate and adapt the DARPA model, including ARPA, very successfully ARPA-E at Department of Energy. It was adapted though, right? It's not exactly replicating DARPA, but it took that model and adapted it. So it's not that we dismiss the possibility of adapting the DARPA model to another agency. It's just that in this case, it really did not seem to be adapted sufficiently to work at NSF. And that was one concern. Another concern was that it was very much driven, I think, both in the way the senator spoke about it, but even in the way it was written, very much driven by competition with China. I understand, right, that all the geopolitical concerns here and the competition with China. I think that's an important consideration in how we shape science and technology policy. Absolutely. However, I was also thinking, and my colleagues were also thinking, like scientists, right? Because I have a PhD. I was a AAAS fellow. A number of my colleagues are PhD scientists. We have that training. We have that frame of mind. We understand why people go into science, why they pursue it. And the young people in this country are not pursuing science because of competition with China, right? They're pursuing science because they want to solve big problems. They could be big scientific problems. They could be big sort of societal problems in which they can hope to apply their science to solve, whether it's climate change or health issues or what have you. And it's not competition with China. And so we pivoted as we were, in the beginning, we were very skeptical about what would work at all at NSF, but we decided, okay, they've got this bill over in the Senate. We're going to give this we're not going to just dismiss it. We're going to give this some real thought. And we started talking to a lot of the thought leaders in the community, including Kay, including Mike, including people who had been around for 20 something years, and whose wisdom and perspective we valued. Former NSF directors, former DARPA directors, former, other government leaders, academic leaders, other thought leaders in the science and policy community from across the country, not just in DC. And in the end, we came up with something that we called the Science and Engineering Solutions Directorate, right? Eventually this became TIP, but this is what we called it in our bill. And it was more about building partnerships, local, regional partnerships around use-inspired science, right? And a lot of, how do you get the academics out of the lab, out of the sort of the boundaries of the university to partnering, not just with industry, of course, with industry, but not just with industry. You're trying to think broader than industry, partnering with civil society groups, partnering with local policymakers like city officials, and so on and so forth to help to shape the research agenda and then drive the research agenda into application for the benefit of society. So that was the framing that we took. It was a very different framing than the Senate bill. So maybe you'll get to that later about how we negotiated. But that was the framing we took. You asked about who we engage with. Well, I talked about all the thought leaders, but of course, it's not just the people with the names that you'll recognize. We made a point in developing this bill of reaching out to reaching beyond the usual suspects, right? We spoke to a lot of representatives of various kinds of minority serving institutions, from the HBCUs to the tribal colleges and Hispanic serving institutions. We spoke to different civil society organizations. We spoke to different organizations that represent or speak for underrepresented voices in different fields of science and engineering, or more broadly. We spoke to different STEM education organizations. Of course, we spoke to the usual suspects as well, like the university associations, the big university, systems that have representation in DC. We know those people. We rely on their expertise. We rely on their perspective. But we tried to walk the walk. This was 2020, and it was, as everyone who's listening knows, that was kind of tumultuous summer in this country, and we are trying to walk the walk, and not just talk the talk of listening to more diverse voices. And I credit in particular my colleague Dr. Sarah Barber, who was our lead on the NSF bill at the time, of going above and beyond to reach out beyond the usual suspects to get input and feedback on the direction we were taking. I'll leave it at that. I know we have a lot more to discuss, but yeah.
Perfect. Well, that's really helpful. Hopefully people appreciate all the effort and work that has gone into this, all the folks that contributed, and really appreciate your work on that. So I want to pivot a little bit more into the implementation now. Obviously, the TIP Directorate is really significant for the agency as well, and what it's achieved as far as regional innovation. Maybe I'll go back to Dahlia on this one about, tell us a bit about sort of what TIP means for NSF and how it's helping regional innovation development.
Well, TIP is terribly underfunded, but I for what we hope it can achieve and what they hope it can achieve, what the community is looking for. But I give tremendous credit to the leadership of TIP. Dr. Irwin, someone help me out with his last name,
Giancandani.
Yeah, thank you. I just know him as Irwin. He first of all, he had to do a lot of work internally to the agency to build buy-in, right? Because this is something new for an agency that's primarily been driven by fundamental discovery research, right? And TIP was this entirely new thing. So he did a tremendous amount of work building the buy-in within the agency, which is really important because it enabled him to partner effectively with other directorates within the agency, and to help build these programs. He was creative in how he issued the first solicitation, and we looked at it a puzzle, saying this is so wide open. But he said, but we don't really know what we're doing here. We're going to need to iterate. So I'm purposely doing it wide open because I want to see what we get. And once we get everything, and boy, did they get a lot of letters of interest the first round. He said, okay, now we're going to do the work to say, oh, we have like 1,000. It was some huge number. It was like a huge number of letters of interest. But I see patterns here. I see connections here, and we're gonna do the active work to try to bring these different groups together, and maybe they can put in a proposal jointly. In some cases, that makes more sense. So I think he was handed this brand new thing that nobody quite knew how to do. And with his team, and Erwin obviously has a tremendous team around him. I don't, he gets a lot of credit for his leadership, but he has a really tremendous team around him, and he hired a lot of good people with a lot of relevant expertise. And I really think they were able to build the beginnings of something really great. And Mike and others may be able to talk more to how the regional innovation engines are actually working on the ground. But from where I sit, they have built the fundamentals of something really great, and it's up to Congress to put real money into it.
So may I a little bit?
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about, how the policy is enabling Irwin and colleagues to like do great things all across the country. And I tell people now, if you look at the regional innovation part of CHIPS and Science Act, I mean, it starts out with what? It starts out with the missions and goals and objectives. And there are 10 technology focus areas. They come from the Senate bill. They also have 5 societal challenges as goals, and those come from the House bill. And as a result, the vision goes through everything that they do. And I will also say that so that means that innovation is not just about making a quantum industry in the United States. It is also about making sure that we have equitable access to education, opportunity, or other services, because that is one of the challenges that's right there at the top. And that informs the policies. So the CHIPS and Science Act gives TIP not just research awards, but also the authority to do a number of other programs, such as expanding capacity, test beds of shared infrastructure, support for boundary spanners, entrepreneurial fellowships, scholarships and fellowships with attention to broadening participation. So all of those are to make sure that, left to their own devices, regional innovation programs could just, encourage innovation in places that already have it, rather than broadening it as something that can happen throughout the country in every community. And I think with that policy structure, NSF was able to like really make real this vision for a democratized, all across the country innovation ecosystem.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for adding that context. And we did want to talk about broadening participation here as well, and how this bill is helping with that. But I want to move on to a little deeper into the implementation phase, turning to Mike to tell us about the universities. What's the role in realizing the vision of the bill? What does this actually mean for regional innovation?
Right. Thanks. So, particularly the regional innovation engines, which is kind of like the marquee piece of the Chips and Science bill that has directly affected universities. The thing about it that really strikes me as novel compared to things that I was familiar with in Competes or Energy Policy Act or some of the other bills that I had worked on when I was in DC. What was really really unusual about this new mechanism is a focus on like the full workforce stack. So Research One universities, we think about have very traditionally thought about that transition from undergrad to graduate programs, and then we think a lot, almost obsessively about PhD training, postdoctoral training, and the transition to faculty positions. And I think which also means that we, with rankings and other stuff like that, we always think of ourselves, as competing at a national level and global prestige. And the regional innovation engines with this sort of workforce stack really did force us to start thinking about, well, you have to actually show results within a regional area. Now, we all would be able to define that on our own, but we had to choose a region, and we had to build partnerships that we had not traditionally done with community colleges, labor training centers. There's always been a lot of connections to like K through 12, but with that sort of notion of people, they're just, undergrads to be, right? Whereas this broader viewpoint that we were forced to take, we started thinking about other transitions, like, what about that transition for the kids who don't go to college? How can we in a Research One university help and facilitate the transition to community college, the transition to training centers, or retraining kinds of opportunities? And that really, to be quite honest, showed up for many, many, many Research One universities, our shortcomings. And so we have really had to, I'm part of a team led by WVU that got one of the Type 1 training planning grants for the Regional Innovation Engine. And that sort of that work that we had to do to lash together the workforce piece, the economic development piece, and the sort of startup entrepreneurial component, which we had always, like most of the Research One universities have like a piece there, but it's having to look at all of those together and figure out how to thread them together in a coherent way. I mean, it was painful to go through, but I think it really, really opened everyone's eyes to just how much we had let some of those relationships atrophy, and how important that is to having, both a national impact but also a regional impact.
That's really fascinating. And thank you for bringing up the partnerships that are so important to this and the workforce development, which is a great transition into what Travis is going to tell us. The STEM Opportunity Alliance. So tell us a little bit about SOA, how it can fit into the goals of the bill to broaden participation, make sure that the workforce is represented, and also obviously addressing the administration's opposition to the current inclusion programs.
Yeah, great question. So the Chips and Science Act is really a pretty bold step towards reinvigorating America's innovation. But without inclusion and a coordinated infrastructure to broaden participation in STEM, we really risk repeating the mistakes of the past, where talent, as you heard, Kay mention, where talent was really left on the sidelines. And that's why SOA matters. So the STEM Opportunity Alliance is, to my knowledge, I believe this is accurate, is the only current nationally coordinated network specifically designed to meet both the STEM talent gap, which we see increasing, and the broadening participation crisis of our country, really durably and at scale. So SOA really seeks to tackle the very set of opportunities and challenges that you just heard Mike talk about so eloquently in one region, but thinking about how to do that across the nation in multiple regions, and to think about an infrastructure to help that happen across those spaces. And so SOA was started. I was approached by Sam Gill, who's the president of Doris Duke Foundation, and Alondra Nelson, who was at the time, this was in 2021, the end of 2021, who was at the time the first deputy director for science and society at OSTP, working with Kay, and the two of them and Siddharth Parikh, our CEO at AAAS, and I started this conversation about really wanting to think about how do we realize the incredible potential that Chips and Science Act really kind of paved the way for. And really, right, all of these previous acts that were leading us into this direction. And could we, in this space with the right partners and the right support from partners like OSTP, NASA, NSF, NIH, could we create something that actually sat outside of the federal government that would be a consistent, kind of have a consistent drumbeat of helping create a community-informed plan to really take a long-term strategic approach to the workforce that America requires and deserves in this generational approach. So the work of SOA was really around creating a national strategic plan that looked towards the workforce, the STEM workforce that America would need by 2050, and taking this long-term approach that would work across multiple presidential administrations, and really thinking about how we leverage that. And so, I think at the time we anticipated that there would be, in our country, some movement, some pendulum swinging around equity and inclusion. I don't know that we anticipated quite the level that we are now seeing. And I think it has made the work of SOA more important than ever. And the reality is that the window to safeguard inclusive excellence in STEM is narrowing, that there's disjointed DEI and inclusion efforts that have really been slow and slowing progress. And in reality, that there's when we look at the SIM ecosystem, if we're very, very honest, which we must be with ourselves, our past has shown a lot of somewhat siloed and non-integrated, really, really positive, but limited in their scope kind of initiatives that have not earned the population trend change that we have aimed for. And that's across industry, it's across education at K-12, higher ed levels, it's across nonprofits and private philanthropy, and even federally. I mean, if we think back to the incredible vision of NSF's Includes Alliance, which I was very involved with at my previous organization, APLU. And so I think we as a community have been evolving towards a really clear understanding of how we integrate the STEM ecosystem to tackle cross-sector problems with cross-sector partners. And that's at the heart of what SOA really is. So we launched in December of 2022 officially at a White House summit. And we've spent the next 14 months co-constructing a nationwide strategic plan. We worked literally physically across the country at 17 different regional meetings, virtual meetings. We had almost 2,000 organizations and individuals giving direct written feedback and crafting a community plan. And now we're in the process of implementing that community plan, and it seeks really to take up the lessons learned through Includes and through TIPS regional innovation, accelerators and engines, to really think about how we build these cross-partner initiatives. So SOA partners are actively aligning efforts and across sectors, from early education to workforce, to training and innovation hubs. And this directly supports and seeks to actualize CHIPS's goals, ensuring that regional innovation doesn't just create jobs, but it actually creates inclusive opportunities for all people. And in a moment where inclusion programs face significant pushback, the STEM Opportunity Alliance is doing the critical systems work to make equity real, to make it really about increasing opportunities for all people. And when we say all people, we literally mean all people, not just with PhDs or four-year degrees, but any person from any community in America, because we need more of everybody in STEM. And so SOA's work is really focused on that systems level work to enable us to catalyze and utilize America's rich talent. And we're really showing that inclusive excellence isn't optional; it's really essential to our innovation economy.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you for all the great work you're doing to implement this and to really be inclusive in the workforce. It's great to see and all the partners you've been able to bring along, and
Yeah.
really nice to witness the
We're,
unfolding of that.
yeah, we're really lucky. We started when we launched in 2022, we started with an initial 93 partners. We're now at over 300 partners, organizations that have committed over $2 billion to work together. So it's incredible. And we're really excited about what we can do together.
Right. Thank you. All right. So I want to move on now to obviously we talked a little bit about the current moment, and looking to the future of what we see as sort of chips 2.0 potentially. So I'm gonna go back to Kay and ask you a little bit about how is the current administration obviously has different views of how this bill could be implemented, what we might be able to accomplish for American innovation and competitiveness. What do you see as the future of this, where we are now, what can be achieved or not?
Well, I'm going to start by saying I don't know what the future is, and I'm watching closely as much as I can from the outside as to what's happening. So one limited piece of good news is that so far the CHIPS and Science Act still stands. It has not been repealed, and that of course means both the CHIPS part of it and the science part of it. As Dahlia has already mentioned, a lot of the implementation, especially for the NSF part of CHIPS and Science, is going to depend on whether the money, the appropriations are there. And that, of course, has me worried because already, this administration has put forward well, I don't even know how to say, substantial, devastating, unprecedented cut to NSF and other science agencies' budgets. I don't know yet what Congress is going to do with that. But I will say, I'm as always, I try to be as optimistic as I can. And I'm looking to some of the things that we're talking about as bipartisan universal values. The notion that we need to expand the geography of innovation, I think, is still a shared value. And that means, of course, rural areas. That means states that are in the middle of the country, away from our coast, which have traditionally been the centers of innovation. I think Republican legislators and Democratic legislators can still come together on that. So I think the promise of these regional innovation engines is still there. And I also think the spirit of inclusion is still there. Inclusion means different things to different people. It may not mean that people from underrepresented groups, but I think it still means, people from underrepresented geographies. And there's an overlap there. As we found, in our conversations with historically Black colleges and universities and Hispanic serving institutions, they are all over the country, in every state. And, therefore, I hope we can hold that spirit, find the common ground in the spirit of inclusion as we go forward.
Yeah, thank you for pointing out the realities and also the hope of this moment, and we need to keep that going to look to the future. So I guess I alluded to this, but I'm curious, Dahlia, what you think about if there's a CHIPS 2.0, what that might look like, if that might include things that were not in the first version, and what do you think is possible in the current Congress or in the next Congress during the second half of Trump?
Well, I think I do not have a crystal ball. I think it's fair to say there will not be a CHIPS 2.0 in the current Congress. I'm confident enough on that front. Um, Look, even last Congress, we had trouble getting through some very bipartisan bills, like a Quantum Initiative Act reauthorization.
Mhm.
This Congress, so far in our committee, we've held one markup of a few small bills that we had already marked up and moved through the House last Congress. That's how slow it's moving. We're now at the end of May. In 2010, Kay talked about the history of the Competes Act. In 2010, when we were doing the Competes Act reauthorization, by the end of May, we had already moved through multiple markups and almost stitch together the entire version of the House bill by June 1. So it's slow going, and it's slow going because of the larger politics right now, not necessarily specific to science in Congress. But then you look on the administration side and you see the actions they're taking with respect to science. And it's deeply troubling. And frankly, as much as my boss, the ranking member, Zoe Lofgren, is committed to trying to continue to move bipartisan legislation. She says this publicly all the time. She's sincere, entirely sincere about it. We are having to spend most of our time right now playing defense against all these actions on the administration side, carrying out our oversight responsibilities. And it's a I don't know what word to use. It's a frightening time on many fronts, including for the state of and future of U.S. science. So it's hard for me to think about a CHIPS 2.0. I want to say we need to fund CHIPS and science, 1.0. Do we have other ideas somewhere, milling around the back of our heads? Do others out in the world have ideas? Sure. And may we get to the day in the foreseeable future where we can sit down on a bipartisan basis and really flesh out those ideas. I'm going to try to wear the K hat here and be the optimist and saying we're going to get there. I just don't know the path to get there at the moment.
I'm going to endorse that because we do have actually some ideas. Because there will be for me, an America Competes 5 someday. I think of the and science part as America Competes Part 4. And Dolly, I mean, there are a couple of things that were left on the cutting room floor for CHIPS and Science Act. Just one example, a robust federal effort on sexual orientation and gender identity data within science and engineering. And there are, things that, even with the new TIP Act, there will be follow through as these programs go on. They will benefit from some clarification of legislation of the next directions. One example of that is not in the TIP Directorate. The CHIPS and Science Act has some robust provisions on ending gender-based harassment and sexual harassment in the sciences, and responding at last to a National Academies report that came out nearly a decade ago. But that legislation in the CHIPS and Science Act was only intended as a first step. After this first phase, there will be more that federal agencies and universities can do to make sure that we end sexual and gender-based harassment in the sciences.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for bringing the political realities into this, as our listeners need to be aware of that. But also additional details are really helpful in what you're thinking, looking ahead. So I want to turn to Travis now. Obviously, we're in a tough time right now with the administration in terms of the work that you're doing as well with partnerships. How do you sort of see this hindering what you're trying to do, or what would need to change to really achieve this vision?
Yeah, I mean, what are you talking about? Like, yes, understatement, right? I really credit, I think much of the success that the STEM Opportunity Alliance continues to have in this space, I really give huge credit to our SOA director, Stephanie Rodriguez. Dr. Stephanie Rodriguez, we were able to convince to come to AAAS to help us. I was one of the original, co-founders and the architect of SOA. But Stephanie, as the director, has really brought this initiative into some incredible productivity and been really, really thoughtful. Her background working, she's a former STPF fellow herself, and her background as a STEM Next Opportunity Fellow at the Department of Labor has been really, really incredible in helping us think through, how we continue this work. And really at its heart, SOA's National Community-Driven Plan is a workforce and economic competitiveness plan. It is a plan to ensure America's innovation and research infrastructure has the human capacity to realize its full potential and to address, the world's largest problems. So with that really as the focus, yes, we're seeing increased uncertainty in federal support for inclusion and equity initiatives, whether that's through political rhetorics or legal decisions. Um, and that unpredictability creates real friction for implementation, and it creates real chaos in the STEM ecosystem, which we're seeing, across student enrollment in higher education, both at a domestic and global space. We see that around the financing and funding of really, really critical, basic science and health science, which is absolutely essential to our country's success. And we even see it in this real kind of mechanistic way. You might have seen, Siddharth Parikh talk at the Senate Appropriations Committee hearing recently around the mechanistic kind of impoundment by default, which is occurring right now in federal agencies where funding just simply isn't flowing. Already appropriated, approved, funded, right, for fiscal year 2025. And so in the midst of all of these, this kind of space, there really is friction around implementation and distraction around achieving our goals. And so we as a community have to both respond thoughtfully, strategically, and we have to keep our eyes on the long-term, absolutely critical work that we still need to pursue. And so the reality is that our economy and national security can't afford to exclude talent, not global and definitely not domestic talent. And SOA's cross-sector coalition, from philanthropy to higher education to industry, allows us to advance this work regardless of the administration in power. And that's really, really important. Federal work and investment is a crucial part of this work. It is not the only part of this work. And so we have an opportunity in particular to think about what the future could bring, what we can do as a STEM ecosystem now, and build for the future where undoubtedly, I am confident that the power of the American innovation and inspiration economy will come back to our core foundation around funding research and innovation. And we need to be thinking about how we do that more effectively, more efficiently. And there's real opportunity for us to be building that now. And so what we need moving forward is clear federal commitment to that innovation. And that means not only funding, but also policy alignment, data transparency, and accountability. We also need to ensure regional partners, especially those in rural and underserved areas, have the capacity to participate meaningfully. We have to get away from, hubs of innovation only being on coasts or in big cities. And we have to really think about America's greatest asset, which is its rich, tapestry of experiences and knowledge bases. And so SOA isn't waiting. We're actually building that ecosystem now, because equitable STEM ecosystems and opportunities are the only pathway to sustain American competitiveness. And I think that there's a way for us to do that that will draw in more and more public-private partnerships. And we're very lucky. SOA has always had bipartisan support, and I think that's been crucial to the success of this work. And I'm really excited for the future that we have.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that was the original premise of this conversation, is how do we really include everyone who, is all over the country, different types of talent, folks that have less opportunities and all of that. So that's really important.
It's the thing that we're seeing so many other countries try to fight, because they think it's up for grabs, right? It's why we're seeing universities across the world try to attract American talent, because what we have in spades in America is a broad range of backgrounds and perspectives, and a space where those we've widened the aperture of science, right? And that allows for innovation to truly occur. And so we actually need to invest more in that widening and more in that utilization for America's competitiveness.
Yeah, definitely agree. Well, that could be a whole other hour conversation. So maybe we'll do another one. So since you mentioned universities, and I want to turn to Mike to tell us a little bit how are universities coping with this situation? What do we think about implementation of chips? And then how can we really, again, support full talent or rather prevent the loss of talent that's occurring right now to other countries?
Right. Well, I mean, needless to say, higher ed uh, is a focal point for administration attention and attack, and it is a challenging time at the moment in higher ed. We will, we're pushing back on all sorts of executive orders and things like that. A lot, just as Kay and Dahlia said, it's hard to actually really see what the future looks like. There's a lot of stuff in play, and even if the Trump administration gets a few wins on some of these things, that can like dramatically remodel um, higher ed and research one universities dramatically. So really hard to say, what it's going to look like, 3 or 4 years hence. However, um, the the turn to looking at um, you know inclusion from a viewpoint of socioeconomic status as well, regional status, first gen students, that kind of a thing. I think we've got universities sort of doubling down on that. And that does help us broaden our coalition of support, because we'll have impact, um, across a wider swath of society. I think the other thing that we're, looking at, and this is where the sort of turn to regional innovation really potentially can help us, in that, we are starting to figure out, how to like really partner more effectively with industry, with local workforce development boards, with community colleges, and build a stronger network and embed ourselves more firmly in our regions. And I think that can only help us weather, the storm that we're facing at the moment. I think, there are things that, because some of these mechanisms, like the regional innovation engines, it's a $160 million award. So that's not sort of like an individual PI thing. So there's a lot of effort that, at least here at Pitt, that we're doing to sort of, develop our faculty skill set to better lead large teams, get better at, writing these big proposals. I think we're, one of my colleagues here who works on community engaged research, we're figuring out how to support our faculty, and again develop their skill set in like community engaged research, and that kind of a broadening of the things that faculty get credit for. um, I think we'll slowly start turning the ship, and that, when faculty are, everybody responds to incentives, and so when we do recognize, enable, and facilitate the ability of our faculty to work with and partner with community groups, nonprofits, local agencies, that kind of stuff, I think that really helps us cement ourselves in. And I think that that's kind of what part of this, part of our response is to do that. And so there may be some odd, silver linings to this really dramatic sort of kick in the teeth that we're in the midst of getting.
May I, Adriana, at the risk of repeating what Mike's saying, and or maybe just to emphasize it, um, with crisis comes opportunity, right? And it's what Mike is basically saying. And uh, we've been speaking to this for a few years, but it is more poignant than ever. This need to rebuild the trust between the scientific community and society, between universities and society, because what we are seeing is a reflection of the fracturing of that trust. As the administration is taking the actions it's taking, there's no outcry, very little outcry from the public about what's happening to science and to universities because of, in part, because of that breakdown in the trust. And so this community engaged science, the greater partnering, the regional innovation, the broadening participation efforts, these are all critical, not just to advancing science and to moving science out of the lab into use. They're critical to rebuilding trust,
Yep.
to building up your third-party validators,
Yep.
right? Who can also go to the members of Congress and say, hey, but what that university is doing, they're not just a separate walled-off tower. What they're doing matters to me and my community. I will tell very briefly. I was moderating a panel about a month ago. I was invited to moderate on something like outside of my normal area of expertise, and the panel had social impact entrepreneurs on it. It was adjacent to the World Bank spring meeting, and these were people with a global outlook. There was a young, for me, 30s is young, a young man who was born in South Sudan. His family were refugees from South Sudan. He grew up in some, I don't remember exactly, but some small city in the middle of the country. And he told the story. There was a university a mile down the road from where he grew up, and there was a large South Sudanese refugee population where he grew up. There was a whole community there. And he said it might have been that university might as well have been an entire world away. They were a mile down the street, and they might as well have been an entire world away, right? And I've heard, like, you hear those anecdotes, and they're not just anecdotes. That is actually happening. That's been happening across the country for decades, where the university really, in so many places and in so many ways, has really holed up and become this stereotypical ivory tower. Not every university. And Mike sits in Pittsburgh, where Carnegie Mellon and Pitt have done tremendous work to build partnerships across the city, and become really community engaged, right? To use that term again. But they're more the exception than the rule. And I think universities, I get on my high horse whenever I have the opportunity to talk to researchers in universities. Now's the time to really be taking a hard look at that and think differently about their future role in their communities and society.
And and one other thing that we need to be doing, and I have yet to figure out exactly how to do this, but when researchers are engaging with the policy world and the political world, I mean, we do need to do a better job of understanding how to provide science advice in a clear, usable way, and understand what our role is, right? The public funding that built our expertise, is one component of it. But I think as Matt Grossman at Michigan, sort of talks about, every time you speak as an expert, you're you're expressing that publicly funded knowledge that you built, but also your values and also your preferences, and you have to be really clear on what why you're being invited to the table, and really focus on that expertise that was built. And the politicians, they think they're there for, they were voted into office for the values and the preferences. And so we want to make sure that um, we do need to somehow figure out how to better equip our faculty for those kinds of interactions. And that's something that largely that's we kind of don't do. So I think that's an area that we do need to work on.
And may I? So I want to take it to the audience. So I know that listening is a group of science, technology, policy fellows. I think the answer is up to you. It's up to us, because I'm going to say more than most people, this audience knows how to bridge those gaps between science and policy, because of course you've done it, starting from when I interviewed many of you and had you do those 2-page policy memos, which I'm sure the people in the audience remember. And because it is going to take all of us to be able to rebuild and restore the bridges of trust between society and the science and engineering community and the policy community. And it's a big task. And although, I have some ideas for Chips and Science 2.0, and they center around, authorizing public participation in science, community engaged science, citizen science, etc. Really, that work has to be done now by all of us. And yeah, and I know the audience, many of you know one or more of us. So that, we've been working together for, in some cases, like 20 years, 20 plus years, in like moving forward this dialogue between science and policy. And I know that over the years, the fellows, the more and more of the policy fellows have joined in this community. So I think we can do this, and we can build, these alliances and, enable that really vital link between scientific inquiry and our broader society to really thrive, even in a very difficult environment.
Yeah. I would just add, oh, sorry, Mike. I was just going to add that, like, I'm definitely in the camp that, like, I believe we have to fix ourselves. And I say that both as a recovering professor, my work in higher education, and my work in STEM, building out STEM talent and education now. So, I think that what Kay's saying, the kind of the call to action that Kay's saying, I completely agree. And I think that we want to think about our work being reinforced by policy, being reinforced by funding at the federal and private level. But we as a community, it's up to us to re-envision and shape what we're doing in higher education, R&D, STEM, etc.
Right. Well, you all made my job easier by giving really great closing remarks here and what everyone can do. But I really want to just thank all of you for being here today. I encourage our listeners to think more about this question of what we can do to preserve the vision of the bill and all our different sectors that we're in. And hopefully we can follow that up with more conversations. I think any of the things we discussed here today could be its own thing. But hopefully we gave you a good overview of this process and what's been done. So I really appreciate everyone's time today, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Adriana.
Yep.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.
Wonderful.